Okay. All right, we're going. I've also had the fortune of having been on Dr. Lagomasino's thesis committee at East Carolina University. So I know him from a while back, and just seen his career launch tremendously. He has a bachelor's degree in geological sciences from FIU, university known to some of us, Florida International University. A master's of science in geology at East Carolina, and another degree at FIU, a PhD in geological sciences. And since I think about 2016 or 17, he's been back at ECU as a new member of the Department of Coastal Studies at the Coastal Studies Institute on the Outer Banks. And his talk today is very much reflecting his current and recent research, integrating satellite and other remote sensing observations to study coastal change with a specific emphasis on mangroves. So I hope this attracts a kind of a nice gamut of folks from campus and from industry and practice here in the area. He's available toward the end of his talk. We could take some questions. We'll have a definite stop by 4:30. And if you need to reach out afterward, feel free to let me or David know, and we'd be happy to put you in touch. Let you go ahead, David, and give us some R&R. Take the brunt of all the coastal hurricanes you can on the Outer Banks for us. We see your screen. And you're still muted. There you go. Thank you.
There we go. All right. Let's see. Now it stops. All right. Thank you, Tom and Eileen, for the invitation. It's nice to sort of present to you a bit about what we've been doing, one within our own lab, but also what we're kind of doing out at the Coastal Studies Institute. So, Tom, your date was a little off, but I started 2019. So starting now my third year at East Carolina University in the Department of Coastal Studies, and we are situated in the Outer Banks. We're on Roanoke Island in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Here, a lot of my talk is going to be focused on the effects of cyclones in tropical regions. Here, we're just looking at a nice sort of animation of the 2017 cyclone season here in the Caribbean, right? So we had a number of major category storms, strong category 3, 4, and 5 storms hit the United States: Harvey, Hurricane Irma, and Hurricane Maria. And so we look at sort of the effects, and 2017 kind of stood out as this sort of major year, but then we were followed by another sort of set of 2018, 2019, 2020 years of storm activity, right? So what does that mean for our coastlines? And so we talked about that R&R. So in this case, I'm relaxation, right? Rest and relaxation here, and we focus on our coastal areas, right? These areas have our coastal wetlands, our mangrove forests, our salt marshes, the estuaries, right? And these ecosystems, right? These wetlands, these estuaries, right? That's what sort of feeds into this good life, right? I mean, why we want to be out there is because of these resources and landscapes that these coastal ecosystems provide. Right, but as we start to build that good life and change that sort of infrastructure along the coast, right, that then feeds back into either degradation or enhancement in some cases of the estuary and the wetlands. And so being able to make sure that if we want to keep that good life going, that there is this sort of balance between those coastal ecosystems and our sort of human demand of coastal resources. And so many of you know this, right? But that coastal wetlands serve many ecological purposes. And for countries around the world, when we kind of consider mangrove forests in particular, right? They supply, timber and fuel to many coastal communities, right? They're a source for major fisheries at various life stages, right? And they're also sort of an important source of carbon sequestration, right? And holding on, not only sort of holding on to the sediments, but also having a high productivity, particularly in these tropical ecosystems. And so changes in those extents have the potential to release, a lot of carbon. Whether that goes directly into the atmosphere or not, that's a whole other story, but the fact that they are these carbon dense ecosystems. But beyond their sort of ecological purposes, right, they do really help to reduce social and economic losses along the coast. So here, really just kind of showing you a basic schematic of the role of, in this case, coral reefs and mangroves in terms of reducing wave height and storm surge to coastal communities, right? So if you have these intact kind of natural coastal barriers, you're able to reduce that wave energy that's coming into your coastlines and protect those human communities, those human ecosystems that are there along the coast. However, you start to degrade or remove those ecosystems, you lessen that dampening capacity of those coastal ecosystems, and you're bringing in more wave energy, one, to cause more damage, but also to create more erosion or more flooding problems, right? And so the role of these ecosystems is to help reduce those impacts to the coastal areas. And in fact, when you consider mangroves as a whole, annually they reduce up to about 65 billion in property damage, and also protect more than about 15 million people, and this is worldwide. So here, this is a recent study that came out by Menendez et al., looking at sort of the global flood protection benefits of mangroves. And when you look at with mangroves or without mangroves on each of these different columns in terms of land flooded, people exposed, right? There's this sort of step up when we kind of consider that world without mangroves and how that might increase in these coastal ecosystems. So being able to hold on to these mangroves are able to protect human livelihoods. But we know that that's not equally distributed around the world, right? The distribution of mangroves and coastal wetlands is not evenly distributed. The socioeconomic vulnerability in terms of, right, the economics of a local region, how many people might be more in more vulnerable regions, right? We know that that's not equal around the world. And so there are these particular hotspots where we do see a bit more or higher exposure in certain areas, right? And so what we want to do is kind of identify, what are those areas where we see this kind of increased benefit. But at the same time, right, we have these protective ecosystems, but their locations are also valuable for other things, right? Like commodities. And so here you're seeing a picture taken from the Rufiji Delta in Tanzania, and showing a recent sort of slash and burn in an area of mangroves that is now being converted to rice paddies and salt pans. And so these coastal locations also serve other purposes that help to feed the world, right? Or bread baskets for the world. And so, that picture was in Tanzania, but let's, here showing you a high resolution image of the Sundarbans in Bangladesh, and really showing that sort of juxtaposition of what you're seeing here, mangroves in the green, and then rice paddies adjacent to those mangrove forests there in the sort of different shades of purple. Right, and so the communities that are there, but now you remove that forest, you've made these sort of artificial polders and elevation changes within the rice paddies, and so you're kind of creating a new landscape that can become more vulnerable because you've reduced that mangrove extent. So that's on the sort of anthropogenic side of things, right? But natural disturbances can also lead to these dramatic die-offs, right? And so here, like the picture in the background is from the Florida Keys about 2.5 years after Hurricane Irma passed through in 2017. And so you're looking at now what is a completely dead forest that has yet shown much sign of recovery. And so how can we start to tease out, well, what's happening? You know, what are humans impacting these coastal landscapes, and what might natural disturbances affect these landscapes? And so we turn to satellite data in this case. And so, you know, there are a bunch of sort of different satellite measurements out there, some that are, you know, tailored for ocean applications, for terrestrial applications, for atmospheric, cryogenic. And these satellites are continuously collecting data. And what we can start to do is pull information from these different sensors to get a better idea of what's happening on the Earth's landscape and seascapes. So in one in particular satellite that has been around for 5 decades, since really the 1970s, is the Landsat Archive, right? And so next week, Landsat 9 launches, but Landsat 5, 7, and 8 have been workhorses for the sort of the Landsat image archive. And these satellites are collecting data in sort of different electromagnetic wavelengths. And so we can start to pull out different band combinations from that to tease out specific unique features on the land and on the sea. So here you're seeing a nice sort of Landsat mosaic of but what we can do is, this is just one image that we can sort of visualize in different bands and tease out various types of landscapes. Again, we also have 40, 50 years of this data. And so what we can start to do is we're taking that snapshot every 16 days with Landsat imagery, and we can really start to see how that landscape changes over time, what different environments are being converted out of other landscapes or other seascapes, and really start to quantify the rates of change along the coast. And so I like showing this because this is a pretty stark example, but this is a mangrove forest in the island of Sulawesi, Indonesia. And what you're seeing about 2005, 2006 is this rapid deterioration, this rapid loss of the landscape, as this mangrove forest is being converted, one from a mangrove to now shrimp ponds. And so, you can see the rates through the animation, but we can actually then look at, differences between 96 and 2017 and get an estimate of that loss. And we can also then look at, essentially the annual time step. So we can look at acceleration or deceleration of these various hotspots as they form around the world. One thing I do like to note about this here as well, or this animation, is it actually comes from a marine protected area. And so we can start to see, the role of humans in the effectiveness of protected areas. And so one of the sort of follow-up studies that we're looking at is trying to understand that role. But remote sensing, satellite data plays an important role in that. But we know that, yes, mangroves take up a certain amount of landscape, but their structure can be completely different. So here you're seeing a mangrove forest in Gabon in West Africa. And these are some of the tallest mangroves in the world. So the picture you're seeing here, those trees are about 50 meters tall, reaching about 60 meters. And so you have some of the tallest forests in the world, but then you go to a place like Yucatan in Mexico, and you have some of the shortest, right? Some that are about waist high. It's a very similar genus, but that environmental characteristic, that environmental setting, the geomorphology, the coastal setting really drives what we kind of see in that change in structure. So we go out into the field, right? We have to go and we collect data out in the field, but as those folks, you know, that have gone into a mangrove forest can know how difficult it can be. You know, and sometimes we get stuck, right? Sometimes in collecting data, it's can be a bit dangerous as well. In this case, you know, having a bit of fun with some of our colleagues, right? But it can be quite difficult and challenging to collect this information, right? And so that's where, again, remote sensing plays a role, and to be able to make these observations where field data is lacking, right? And so what we were able to do with this you know, particular set of data that we collected in various sort of sites around the world is that we're actually able to map that global distribution of mangrove canopy height, and with that also sort of that above ground biomass. And so we've been able to do this at that global scale and at a 30-meter resolution. So at a very sort of high resolution from a global data product standpoint. And one thing that we found from this particular study is that this distribution of canopy height is driven in part by, right, the amount of rainfall, amount of temperature, but also the frequency of cyclones. And so where you saw more cyclonic activity, you have shorter trees, right? So the fact that these storms are coming through, they essentially give the mangroves a haircut every 5 to 12 years, right? And so that limits how high these trees can grow. So we can use that information from Landsat. We can map out the extent of mangroves for a particular year, and we can look at where those areas have been gained and lost over a particular time period. We can use radar data, in this case, TandemX data, it's a German space agency satellite. We can then calculate from that radar data canopy height. You see the distribution of that canopy height here, and actually then calculate this above ground biomass. And so we wanted then to take this step forward. Now, yes, we can do these sort of extent and change maps and structural complexity maps, but we wanted to take, again, that sort of one step further. And we looked at, you know, what is the role of humans and natural phenomenon in driving mangrove loss. And so here are just kind of some nice examples that we'd like to show. Here on the left, Indonesia. So we've mapped out the extent of mangrove loss, but then also sort of said, well, this actually corresponds to conversion to aquaculture. So the conversion to shrimp ponds, right? In Myanmar, on the right-hand side, we're actually getting conversion to rice paddies. So in this case, kind of more of the agriculture. And then in places like in Bangladesh, in the Sundarbans, where it's largely unaffected by humans, but we do have this sort of this natural retreat of the shoreline and through shoreline erosion. So we can start to classify the loss drivers themselves through this. And we were able to do this again at that global scale. So what you're seeing here in the map is kind of the major reason for loss in each of those 1 degree cells. And we can see the distribution of each of those types of loss along longitude and latitude. And what we got from this is that about 64% of global losses have an anthropogenic origin. Most of that coming from the conversion to commodities, and most of that is concentrated within just a few countries in Southeast Asia. And so what we wanted to do from there is then, well, let's look at these different continents. And so we've separated here, kind of aggregated by continent of those different loss drivers, where we have the effects of humans in terms of the conversion to settlements or commodities, so rice, shrimp, those types of things. and then non-productive conversion. So this might be local cuttings for charcoal, or the development of a road that might cut off the hydrology for a coastal region and lead to a mangrove die-off. And then on the natural side of things, we have shoreline erosion and these extreme weather events. And what sort of point you now for the rest of this talk is really looking at the effects of those natural driven events, erosion and extreme weather events in North America. And a lot of that is driven by these frequent hurricanes that we have in the Caribbean. And here we're kind of seeing that frequency map. So here I haven't updated for 2021 yet, but here we're essentially seeing the number of cyclones, so tropical storm through category 5 over pretty much the last almost 40 years. Those areas of white, you're seeing, close to almost one almost every year, right? So we can kind of see these hot spots in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Caribbean Sea, but also along the east coast of the southeast coast of the United States, right? So we can kind of see these sort of hurricane highways, right? And so one thing that we're trying to do is really, and this gets at that other R&R, is the resistance and resilience of that ecosystem, right? So one thing that we're really trying to look at is, and one thing that we've started to develop is this research framework to go beyond the sort of single ecosystem response to tropical storms. And what we're really trying to key in is on this effect size. So pretty much how much has the system been disturbed by a cyclone? And then how long does it take to get back to those kind of pre-storm conditions, at least when it does. Sometimes it doesn't, right? And so trying to define these sort of metrics of resistance and resilience from a remote sensing standpoint. And what we want to consider is also that long-term hurricane regime, right? So we have these repeat disturbances. So how might that change in the frequency of storms also then affect that sort of current effect size and return to baseline for a single storm? And lastly, we need to consider those antecedent conditions. So what might be other disturbing factors that might exacerbate or lessen these effect size and so essentially your resistance and resilience metrics? How might, again, those preceding conditions affect that storm or affect that response of the ecosystem? And so we know in the case of hurricanes that they're actually kind of a resilience builder, right? They are bringing in new sediments, with that delivering nutrients. It's kind of flushing out old water and bringing some new water in it, whether it's ocean water or it's fresh water, but you're kind of flushing the system out, cleaning it out. And so what you get to sort of happen here is we go from close to the shoreline to closer to the hinterland, that we get a lot of this sort of sediment deposition, and again with that delivery of phosphorus, a limiting nutrients, at least in the case for South Florida, and that helps to then stimulate this. So yes, you have this impact of the cyclones, that physical impact that's damaging these ecosystems, but you have that resource that's needed to jumpstart that recovery. But we know also that where some areas there's lots of recovery, we can also see that in other areas there's this effect of this delayed mortality. And we can see that set in, about 9 months after a storm, and you can also impact large larger trees. And so a recent study by Dr. Radabal and others from USF and Fish and Wildlife showed that following 9 months after Hurricane Irma in the Florida Keys and parts of 10,000 islands, that we see this sort of additional mortality that happens. And so you get trees or ecosystems right after the storm that, you know, seem like they're okay, that they're able to cope with it, but, you know, either too much flooding or too much sediment kind of smothers those roots, and that can actually lead to this delayed dieback that we see in some cases. And so what we're using in this case, we want to differentiate, well, what are those resilient areas? And then what are those vulnerable areas? And so we're using satellite time series to identify that effect size, so how much it's been disturbed, and then how long does it return to that baseline. And so we can kind of tease out these kind of 3 unique responses for mangrove forest directly after a hurricane. And so here on the left-hand side is on the x-axis, we have date. On the y-axis here is what's called the normalized difference vegetation index. You can think of this as a measure of how green the landscape is. So the higher number, the greener you are, the lower number, the less green you are. And so looking at forests and different responses, in the top being an area that's pretty resistant to the storm. So in the case of before and after, you know, there's very little change in this metric, suggesting that the forest has been able to stay green over that timeline. Second, here we have damage. And so we can see this sort of significant change in that effect size. We can see a large drop. However, what we are seeing is then this increased trend of recovery of greenness. So this sort of positive slope here suggests that, okay, yes, it was damaged, but we do see progress. We do see sort of regreening and reflushing of leaves within these forests. And then lastly, areas of this persistent damage or dieback is, you know, an area that was green before, has this large change in effect size, but then also has this sort of downward or flat trajectory after the storm, suggesting little to no regreening. And so we can use these different sort of time signatures here to identify the types of vulnerability or the types of resilience response to these of these mangrove systems to hurricanes. So we were able to follow up. We were well poised for this study in South Florida. Not only is it part of the LTER, the Long-Term Ecological Research Program from NSF, we also happened to be flying a NASA instruments just a few months before Irma passed, and we were able to go again. But here's just some of the photos collected in the field about 3-4 months after the storm, right? So you can see lots of damage and tree fall associated with many of these regions. But even a few years later, this is about 2.5 years later, there are some areas that have had this sort of continual damage and have seen little to no regreening. And so we really want to tease out, again, sort of why we see that. And as I mentioned, so we flew this NASA G-Lite instruments. Here on the left-hand side, you can see these blue lines correspond to our flight lines. And so we happened to be there in April, just a few months before Hurricane Irma. We were able to fly again in December of 2017, so just a few months afterwards. And then we just went again recently in 2020 to do a third flight. So looking then at that recovery of these ecosystems. And so in the background here is just kind of one of the sensors is a high resolution camera. And so we're actually able to collect this high resolution imagery from 1,000 feet in the air. And here is just some of the data products that sort of come out of this. On that instrument, there's also 2 lidar sensors. So we get a very high pulse density So a number of laser pulses that are actually sort of reaching the ground and back to the sensor. And so we can see these changes in sort of pre-storm and post-storm canopy in terms of structure, right? How tall the canopy is, but then also how green that canopy is. Right? So we can use that information to look at kind of the function and structure of these coastal ecosystems. And here I just wanted to show some of the most recent imagery that we have. So on the top here, I'll get into this site a little bit more detail, is one of our vulnerable areas. So here, kind of a healthy mangrove forest, the impact right after the storm, and now 2.5 years later, where essentially the left side of the road, you see regreening, but on the right side, you're still seeing, this die-off with very few trees that have been able to make it through. As opposed to on the bottom, you have your sort of intact mangrove forest, you have the impact from the storm here in the middle, and then 2.5 years later, you do see this sort of regreening happening, right? So we know that this area is at least rebounding. It's going to be different in terms of its ecological sort of integrity, but the fact that the mangrove forest still stays as a mangrove forest. So what we were able to do with all of this information, the lidar data, Landsat data, we were able to get storm surge data and wind data. We were able to pull all of this together to identify these specific resilience regions across South Florida. And so that's what you're seeing here on the left-hand side. And we just published recently, just in the past couple months. You're seeing these different classes from high resilience, so something that's either damaged very little or comes back very quickly, to low. These are those areas that I showed that had a very large effect size, but little recovery after that. And so we can see this sort of spatial distribution of these. And what we found after Hurricane Irma was that it led to actually one of the largest mangrove dieback events recorded globally. And so we had about 10,700 hectares of this blue area, which is indicative of that sort of large die-off area. And what we wanted to do is that, okay, well, not only identify where these particular locations are happening, but what might be driving those cases, right? Why might we see those specific spots in general as die-off? And so we took this one step further, is that we also then looked at, well, what was the elevation of those various groups? How did that relate to storm surge? And then how that relates to species there on the last here. And so we looked at, here is the distribution, right? The frequency of those pixels that occur at various elevations. And so that low resilience category occurs at lower elevations. And what I'll point to is there's little change in elevation here, right? We're looking at a very flat landscape, but changes of 10 centimeters or less can actually be a huge valley in the Everglades. And so these low elevations, we saw sort of a concentration kind of occurring within these low resilience areas. When we consider storm surge, more than 90% of the dieback occurs in areas where storm surge exceeded the ground by 1.4 meters above the ground. And so again, most of this is then occurring in areas of relatively high storm surge. And lastly, we also see a species effect. And so here, sort of the three major species of mangroves in South Florida, areas of a mix of species, and then sort of a mangrove adjacent kind of species. And what we're seeing is that the majority of loss actually occurs within this one particular species, the Abyssinia, in this case, sort of the black mangrove species. And so what we're getting from this is, well, it's the geomorphology, right? The setting, right? The elevation, that storm surge potential, those are kind of causing or areas that sort of overlap with these low elevation, or sorry, low resilience areas. And these also just happen to be areas that black mangroves can have a competitive advantage over the other two mangrove species. So these Avicennia mangroves are populating areas of low elevation in these areas that are kind of these bowl-shaped, these endorheic basins. And so we see the species effects really because of the environmental setting. But again, that really drives at affecting that one particular mangrove species. And so what we're getting from this is kind of a modification on the earlier figure I showed, is, well, in areas of high resilience, where you have your pre-storm conditions, you have post-storm, right? You have storm surge come in, that's delivering those sediments. Yes, you're heavily damaged in those taller forests, but you're jump-starting it, right? You've brought in new nutrients to be deposited. However, in those low resilience areas, these are areas that are in lower elevation and kind of confined by these sort of topographic highs near it. So it's kind of forming these bowl shapes. So what happens then is you get storm surge, that water, that sediment gets deposited in these bowls, that stays there. And so that prolonged flooding can then lead to sort of the smothering of those roots, the lack of oxygen. And yes, these mangroves can take flooded conditions, but when those conditions are stagnant, that's when you start to see sort of the deterioration of the root material and eventually the death of the tree. And so it's these particular basins that are most vulnerable to the effects of the sort of storm surge and flooding after a particular storm. So I just showed you that was for one storm, but again, we can kind of look at the sort of full record to look at that legacy of storms in these particular regions. So here, time on the x-axis, again, that measure of greenness on the y-axis, right? Higher, more green, lower, less green. And you can see an area that has been degraded, but it's elastic, right? It's hit by a hurricane, but it's able to bounce back. It's able to get to its pre-storm conditions within a few years, as opposed to those areas that are degraded and vulnerable. And so you have these hurricane events that happen, but it never quite reaches its pre-storm conditions. So there's this sort of step effect until eventually it leads to, in the end, a die-off zone. So what we're able then to do is to separate out, well, what is a healthy mangrove forest in terms of its kind of it being undamaged? What might be damaged from a storm, but we see it then maybe regenerating. So where is that area that's resilient? And then what's that area that is damaged, but then it dies off, right? So that's where we start to tease out these various classes. And we can do that at scale, right? So these were just one individual region that we're looking at, one individual pixel through time. But here we can then see it across the landscape for various storms. And we can see that for Hurricane Irma, it's really one of the largest impacts that we've seen compared to a Category 5 storm in 1992, Hurricane Andrew, and Cat 3 storms, Katrina and Wilma in 2005. And so using that time series and that sort of time signature of the response, we can start to tease out different loss and gain types across South Florida and other parts of the world. So we can tease out an area that's been maybe degraded or an area that's been lost to shoreline erosion or dieback, but we can also look at that landward expansion. On the terrestrial side of things, island expansion, when we're considering the sort of growth of mangrove forest out of water. And so what we did back in 2020 was kind of look at, well, what is that sort of annual cyclonic impact to mangroves across the Caribbean, right? So I've been focused a lot in Florida, but what is it happening across the Caribbean? And what we see is that it's right. The impact of storms is variable. Here in the top left, this is just the affected land area. On the right here is just if we focus it on mangrove areas within the Caribbean. The bottom left here is damage. And then these areas of kind of persistent damage and dieback-ish type areas. And what we see is 2017 stands out, right? There was a lot of hurricane activity in 2017, and it happened to hit a lot of mangrove areas. But within this timeline, right, 2017 stands out. But we know that there was other previous high storm impact years. And so we extended this time series backwards to the 1980s using that Landsat record. And so we wanted to see what was that total area impacted. And so again, time on the x-axis, total mangrove area impacted. And what we do see is that there is this slight but significant increase in tropical storm activity or tropical cyclone activity, a lot of that driven by the landfall of more tropical storms. But when we look at damage in particular, when we compare it to other sort of elevated hurricane years, 2005, 2008, 2017 still stands out as this sort of unique year in terms of damage. And then here on the right is really just kind of it broken down by country in the Caribbean. So really Mexico, Cuba, the United States, all having the sort of most amount of mangroves are going to see the most amount of impact. And so one of the things that kind of came out of this is that tropical storms have a low damage rates, but are actually a significant contributor to mangrove damage. So here on the left, you're seeing in these gray bars in the background, that's the total mangrove area impacted. And then the blue kind of separates into damage in the dark blue and recovery. And so what you're seeing here is that tropical storms by far impact the most amount of land, right? Those are the most frequent storms we have. Their damage rate is relatively low, so meaning that it's not damaging too many coastal areas. But the fact that there's such a high frequency, it actually makes it a very large contributor to the overall sort of mangrove damage. And so that's what you're kind of seeing here in that dark blue. And so, yes, major storms are what cause the most amount of damage, right? Those Cat 3, Cat 4, Cat 5 storms. But we still see that tropical storms actually do influence a lot of mangrove damage across the Caribbean. And the sort of one thing that sticks out, we wanted to look at, well, what might have been different about 2017 compared to other years on record. And so what we did here was we really plotted against this PDSI. So this is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. What we did is look at the drought severity index in the prior year and compared it then to your y-axis here is the amount of impact, and then the size of the circle is the sort of damage to these mangrove forests. So again, 2017 kind of stands out as a year, not only, yes, with high impact of major hurricanes and damage from those hurricanes, but it also had an extreme drought condition in that year prior. So the Caribbean from 2015 to about 2017 was under a very severe drought, most of that affecting Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. And so these were areas, and a little bit of South Florida. And so these were areas that were under drought stress, and then you had major hurricane activity. And so when we consider those other high sort of hurricane years, well, yes, there was a lot of activity, but those happen to be in also very sort of wet years. And so that drought stress might not have been a major factor, but it seems like it might be standing out for 2017. And so these are still things that we're looking into, but 2017 stands out as its own sort of unique season. So kind of going back to this sort of coastal protection model is what might that changing extents if we are deforesting mangroves, we have increases in cyclone frequency or increases in drought stress, how might that then change the resilience of your coastal, your sort of socio-ecological coastal system, right? And so this is what we're sort of taking this, following up with is, using, new satellite data here, talking about JEDI, the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation. So this is a laser sensor on the International Space Station. And here we're looking at across these different resilience categories in South Florida, what the footprint of this JEDI lidar system, and what that's able to do is it teases out various structural components of your forest. And so we can look at canopy related changes and changes in ground. And what we're seeing now after Hurricane Irma is that in those areas of of that dieback, we see little canopy regeneration happening. So that's what you're seeing here on this top graph. And you're really just getting those ground returns, as opposed to those intermediate classes where you do see some of that canopy restructuring. So yes, you've turned over the canopy, new trees, the older trees have died, new trees are coming in, but you are still keeping some form of a canopy there and it's regrowing. In addition, we're also looking at, sort of the integrated coastal zone, right? So not just looking at what's on your terrestrial side of things, right, but what's also in your shallow marine environment. And so we're using Landsat and Sentinel-2, so Sentinel-2 being a new-ish European Space Agency satellite, to then image the seafloor and identify areas of coral reef and seagrass. And in part, we're doing some of that using the ICAR-2 laser sensor, the Atlas sensor on ICAR-2. So ICAR-2 was launched in early 2018. And so this is a green laser that is made for measuring ice sheets, but it actually, because it's green, it's able to penetrate through the water surface. And so that's what you're seeing in each of these. These are different locations on the x-axis here, or these three different figures, where we're looking along the transects and its sort of depth. And so what we're getting is both the water surface here in black, but then also the sea floor that you're seeing here in blue. So we're actually able to retrieve water depth from this instrument, combine that with the Sentinel-2 optical data, and we can create, in this case, we've recreated a bathymetric model for Bermuda at a 10-meter resolution using only spaceborne assets. And so not having to go out and collect sonar data. So we can do this completely spaceborne approach. And so combining all of this information about, well, where are mangroves being lost? Why are they being lost? What's in the shallow seascape? What is the bathymetry of those regions? We can put all of that together, and here we're using the INVEST tool by the Natural Capital Project, and looking then at that coastal exposure and how might coastal exposure change when we consider changes in mangrove extent or changes in coral reef extent. And so what you're seeing here is this coastal exposure index, where the sort of warmer colors mean a higher coastal exposure. And so we can then start to map this out across various Caribbean landscapes or global coastal landscapes to figure out where that coastal exposure may change and target conservation or restoration activities or other types of management activities to help sort of boost that coastal resilience. I do want to make a bit of a plug here for the Hurricane Ecosystem Response Synthesis Network. And so this is a new sort of project, a research coordination network funded by NSF and run out of VIMS. Being one of the steering committee members on this, we're really interested in understanding that ecosystem response and go beyond just the kind of case studies for individual storms, but really start to synthesize, well, what is the impact of various responses from biota to sort of non-biogenic activities and how that may change. And so I encourage you, for folks that are interested in cyclones and hurricane, we have our sort of kickoff webinar on September 29th. I also want to talk a bit about the Coastal Studies Institute and ECU's Outer Banks campus. And so we run the Integrated Coastal Studies PhD program out of this campus. And we have a number of new faculty that have joined. We're right there on Roanoke Island, right in the middle of the marsh, as you can see here. So if folks don't know about it, encourage you all to visit the Institute. And if you want, you can reach out to me and I'd be happy to give a tour. But again, sort of this growing institute here in the Outer Banks. So I do want to wrap up with a bit of conclusions, right? Well, what do we take from this sort of information that I sort of presented today? And, sort of few key points that I'd like to hone in on is that we do need to study the impact areas, right? We need to know, well, those areas of low resilience, how do they respond? Because much of our field sites are kind of centered around those pristine areas. And so being able to consider, well, where are those areas that are not recovering? Those are kind of those areas that we need to study. Yes, case studies are good, right? We need to be able to understand, the role of individual storms on individual ecosystems, but we really need to start going at this synthesis of what is the larger sort of legacy of these disturbances on that socio-ecological coastal system. I showed, the effects of droughts and combined with cyclones, and right, so understanding that what compound disturbances do to ecosystems is also sort of needs to be considered into the future. Also, the selection of field surveys with the amount of remote sensing and imagery available, field surveys should be considering that remote sensing history, right? So we can look at that legacy and select our sites based off of certain legacies going into the future. And then lastly, this sort of connectivity of socio-ecological systems. So I'd like to end here with, our lab, the Coast and Oceans Observing Lab at ECU, right? All of the work that I've showed you here is in part done by me, but also by a number of colleagues and team members, those there on the bottom, right? Ranging from undergraduates to postdocs. And they're really the engine behind much of the research that I've shown you here today. And with that, I'd like to take any questions or discussion. Thank you.
Great job, Dave. Thank you. At this point, if you want to drop a question in the chat, I'd be happy to ask or send it to me. But let's welcome you to unmute selectively and raise your hand or whatever you want to be acknowledged. Just figure we could go a couple minutes. I know the one question I would like to ask is, especially the temporal aspects of the mangroves that you've studied, I was really struck by the stair step kind of cascading downward impact. It reminded me of a kind of theoretical concept in geomorphology of dynamic equilibrium or dynamic metastable equilibrium, where you're on a trajectory, but that you get this little push over the edge. Wondered if you sort of detecting that.
So yeah, I mean, we see this in sort of that ecology as well, right? So that tipping points for certain things, right? Different ecosystems.
Mhm.
You know, that stair step feature, that particular area that we saw is in a unique spot, again, in these kind of endorheic basins along the coast, right? So areas that don't really have a drainage point, right? They drain into their own basin. And so, you know, I think with that stair step that we're kind of seeing is a slight drop in soil elevation with each of those kind of steps. And then you just have this sort of repeat disturbance that comes through, knocks it down again, right? And because it doesn't have those added resources to help either build elevation or spark recovery, right? Those nutrients feeding back into the system.
Yeah.
I think that's where you just kind of see this slow deterioration in terms of greenness. But I also think there's kind of a soil elevation role here, but definitely much more difficult to measure that change in soil.
Yeah, and that road you showed on the one imagery seemed like it had a huge effect locally.
Yeah, for that one spot, because it's also the road. Essentially, it's kind of like a square that's bounded by elevation highs. The road just kind of closes it off. So that's the last sort of elevation high on one spot. And then it just forms this bowl. So water can drain into that bowl, but it doesn't go out. And then that water just stagnates there. And so the road shows it very nicely because it's a really stark line. But there's, you know, I will say that there's also those natural influences, right? You build that storm berm up, you know, with regular sort of, you know, your summer storms, and they're building that elevation, but that means that they're building that dam, right? So the next time something overtops that dam, that water then stays in there. And so we do see it sort of from a natural perspective as well.
Well, don't let the host monopolize our speaker's time. Like to hear somebody else. I could go on another hour and I may out offline, so. Not sure if Jim was trying to ask a question or not. Maybe not. Well, we'll let you get back to your schedules perhaps. Or Eileen, did you have one?
I was going to ask a question about,
Yeah.
Can you project how many hurricanes of particular categories it would take in order to make mangrove forest an endangered species in some of these coastal environments? Or the frequency at which they would have to hit?
Yeah, I like that question. I don't think I can answer that at the moment. I mean, a lot of that's driven by also the kind of direction that it's kind of coming in. So putting certain areas that might be predisposed, right? One hurricane coming from one direction, let's say an east-west direction, may not influence that one area as bad as, let's say, one coming from south to north. And so that also plays a role in what you're sort of inundating. But that's a good question. I think one to kind of dig into a bit more, actually, kind of run some models to figure out like how long it would sort of take to do that recovery. Yeah, I can't answer that right now, Eileen, but I like.
No, it's just something to think about with the projections of increasing storm frequency and intensity. So,
yeah, and I think what does go into that though is if we're thinking about increases in tropical cyclone activity, there's also increases in drought activity, right? So then it's that sort of two waves kind of coming together, right? And so how that plays in, I think, is kind of interesting as well.
okay, thank you.
I see Taylor has a question. Go ahead, Taylor.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. So my question kind of segues off of the wind direction. I noticed that in the presentation that a lot of this overall die-off is caused by the drainage, but I had a question just popped into my mind considering tornadic vortices that the hurricanes can spawn. Do you think it's possible if you had a section of mangrove forest that was hit by one of these tornadic vortices, could that cause a higher level of dieback than if it was just hit by the regular hurricane force winds?
Yeah, so good question there, Taylor. So there is kind of this, I'll say kind of like a double whammy type thing, right? So you have the physical strength of the hurricane, whether that's from the hurricane winds or whatever tornadoes may spin off, right? Those can cause that sort of immediate death and or damage to your ecosystem. And so that's one sort of response that happens right away. And so if you were to have this sort of higher wind activity, then yeah, you can kill off a full area, but because of the physical sort of the mechanical breakage of the tree, whereas those areas where you're getting this prolonged flooding, that's more sort of biophysical in terms of the sense of what's kind of happening in the roots and how that kind of affects the tree from a physiological standpoint, not necessarily from actually being broken. So yes, if you were to increase the winds, let's say a Category 5 storm and tornadoes, yeah, you're going to wipe out large extents directly from the breakage of that tree or the branches of that tree, as opposed to what might happen because of flooding later on. So there are these kind of two different things that we try to distinguish between the physical impact from winds and then the follow-up role of flooding.
Thank you.
Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, I think we're kind of out of time, Jim.
Okay,
But shoot a note to myself or David, and we'll be happy to catch up. We're going to post the recording on the website as soon as we can as well. So that'll be like a YouTube video. And for those still on the line, next week we have Dr. Harvey Syme from UNC. I don't know if you noticed, but we're supporting the Colors proudly. I call her the mothership. And then we have a couple other good speakers. Eric Yondo from ODU is coming. If you like the pixels like I do, we'll have another speaker mid-October. So thanks again for coming, everybody. Stay safe out there and have a good rest of your week.